Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the OHBM Open Science Room. I will be your host, Cooper Smout. And before we get started today, I just got a little bit of housekeeping. So coming up, we have a really exciting Emergent session that has just emerged this morning. And we're welcoming up some people from the Australia-New Zealand Open Research Network. I think, original member, Matt Ling, as well as Michael Doe and Barhoun. So that'll be interesting to talk about how that network can facilitate neuroscience in Australia and try and build that community that we all need to proceed. And as well as that, we've got a couple more emergents that have been booked for tomorrow's session. So in the morning, I quite selfishly booked a session for my pet project, which is Free Our Knowledge. So that's going to be held with Kelly Garner, who will be co-hosting or interviewing me on that. And I thought I'd just give an overview of what that project's about, and with a specific focus on how I think it could help the neuroscience community and angles that we could take it there. And then in the afternoon, so the Free Our Knowledge session is the same start time as this session. And then, so that's 0100 universal time, coordinated time. And then the afternoon, the later session, we have the Open Science Special Interest Group General Assembly. So they'll be explaining the elections, presenting some awards for our week that we've had this week, and doing the close of the Open Science Room. So that will be at 1:40 p.m. East Australia time, which is 0300 Universal time. And we've got some special guests. I believe Remy Gao will be joining us from the UK at some ungodly hour in the morning. And Katie and Tristan will be joining from America at probably a slightly more reasonable hour for them. So looking forward to that. Morning, Tom. Another Anzona. It's good to see you all here. Okay, so that's all the housekeeping I can think of. So I think we can kick off with the Anzon Emergent session. I'll probably bring up Matt first. And so, by the way, for those that are new to this platform, basically you can ask questions in the box down there somewhere. And if you click that, it'll bring up a little box to ask a question, and you can also upvote other questions that you want to hear answered. We've also got, we can also bring up to 4 people on the screen at the same time. So if you are interested in being on screen and having a chat, just raise your hand or just type something into the box, get my attention somehow, and I'll bring you up to have a chat. Just be aware that we are broadcasting this to both YouTube and it would normally be DouYu, but I didn't get the link in time this morning. But we are broadcasting this, so it will be recorded, so just be aware of that. Okay, let me just send an invite to Matt. Let's test this out. And so we've also got Pam. Looks like Michael was here, but I'm not sure he's still around.
I think he slipped down.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad. Long time no see.
Yeah, when was the last time? It would have been at the Reproduce.
Yeah, I think so. November.
How was you? How was your Reproduce workshop?
Oh, it was great. It was really fantastic. And probably the last time I've interacted with, oh no, I had one conference at the start of the year before, pandemic put us all in our interesting state of lockdown, but yeah.
Yeah, well, in the upside down place. I found that was like a thoroughly exciting session for me, particularly because it's in my hometown of Brisbane. So amazing to see so many excited open sciences out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I hadn't connected with, and that's partly what I thought today could be great for. Is I met a lot of neuroscientists at that conference that I hadn't seen in the Anzon space, and really Anzon is just a space. Well, I probably should let you say what Anzon is. That's probably a better question. What can you tell us about Anzon and perhaps how it started or what the sort of history is and where it's come from?
For sure. So Anzorn is now a year and a bit old, I think. It's hard to kind of keep track of it. Is obviously very strongly inspired by the open science community idea that came out of a bunch of the Dutch universities, and trying to provide a bit of scaffold for people that are new to adopting open research practices, so they don't have to feel like they're adopting these alone, because most of us, I presume it's most of us, are finding that because the open practices are not exactly normative at this point. A lot of us are finding out these things for the first time because we are stumbling across them on the internet in a fit of frustration about something that we've observed. And I think it can be very isolating and very, very a lonely experience. And it can be difficult then to work out how to navigate some of these difficulties, whether that's structural difficulties, how to do certain things like where to share data, how to share data, but also those sort of social difficulties. So how do I manage collaborators or PIs or stuff like that that might not share or might not be on the same page with respect to some of these things. And so having a connection with people who are who might have navigated these things before in some, like even if it's slightly more than you, I thought was a really good idea. And so we kind of had this idea to kind of create a bit of a connection, almost like a support group for people that are adopting open research practices, and put out a bit of a call. And we now have a couple of hundred people distributed across a whole bunch of different disciplines and different career stages, and even different roles. So there are obviously PhD students and like early career researchers and things, but also we have librarians and research software engineers and tech research tech officers and that sort of thing in there to kind of share ideas and pass resources around that might be useful to people that are, again, trying to make their processes more transparent and more open.
Yeah, great. So that was actually going to be my next question. Like, because that's the thing, like a lot of these practices and processes are domain general, like GitHub or GitHub, any domain you're in. But I was interested in getting some kind of an idea about what the spread is, like is there a dominant field? I'm guessing there probably is. But, and what's the kind of growing rate? Are we sort of moving out into different fields as we go on, or?
It's a little bit difficult to know because at no point have we really aggressively done a census on who's there. But it's definitely the case that largely because of who we're connected to and how the community spread, it has tended to be made up of predominantly psychologists, or psychological research in neuroscience. There are people in digital humanities, again, partially because it's the shared skill set and the shared interests and shared challenges. A smaller number in biological sciences and physical sciences, but mostly at this point dominated by researchers in psychological science, behavioral science.
Sorry, I just got distracted. I just got the key for to go here to start streaming, but unfortunately can't enter that. I think that ship has sailed. So I guess one thing I noticed is that we don't currently have it set up for different fields, and it could be potentially quite handy to have an idea. When I was thinking about this session, I want to try and find who are the neuroimaging people on hands-on. I know they're out there, like Tom Johnstone, who's been on this in this open science room before, is a director of neuroimaging. And I knew that there were some more out there, but it's just we didn't have a kind of way to connect with them. I started a neuroscience channel, and if anyone is out there and is actually a part of hands-on, hit me up because I'll add you. But I thought perhaps that's obviously what the focus of this conference is about, is neuroimaging, and so we've got some more of the other neuroimagers that are on hands-on that we can bring up here. Who out there? So we've got a few that are part of this network. All right, sorry, my mic is low, apparently. I'll just get closer to the screen. We'll do a manual hack. Is that better, Teal? Okay, cool. Who would like to come up? Anyone? Shall I bring up Michael? I believe you said he was one of the earlier members. Matt? He's giving me a thumbs up. Right, he's coming up. Pam, would you like to join as well?
That's a good idea.
Invites passing. So yeah, I was actually trying to remember how I found out about Anzorn, and I couldn't. Hi, Michael.
Alrighty.
Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along to the online conference. It is kind of interesting doing everything online nowadays.
Yep, rolling with the punches, it seems.
Just adapting as best as you can.
That's right. And welcome, Pam. Thanks for coming.
Hi. Trying to get used to all these new platforms. I swear I've learned many different ones during isolation. I know how to use 5-6 different platforms now.
Yeah. 4 or 5 different platforms going on. The gremlin of the system. Because we're broadcasting around the world in 3 different hubs. Some hubs, particularly like China, can't use certain platforms, and so we're trying to stream like from Zoom to
Parallel.
You, which is like a Chinese like YouTube equivalent. It's chaos, but thanks for bearing with us.
You're handling it admirably. So,
like I said, rolling with the punches. But yeah, so I thought today could be a really good chance for us to connect, because we haven't actually connected like this before.
No.
And sort of maybe chat about how we think we could support each other, how Anzorn can support us, and potentially how we can try and sort of build that community, because we are stronger together. So the more of us that get onto this network, I think the better.
Yep.
So I guess, don't know how we start.
Guess I can start a little bit with what I do, and then we can sort of take it from there, and maybe Pam can also talk about what she does as well. So basically, I work within the neuroscience arena, mainly in relation to non-invasive brain stimulation. Same with Pam, we kind of use transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. I have done a little bit of EEG work. So the last study of my PhD, I looked at using combined TMS EEG to look at neurobiological responses to brain stimulation. And I think one thing that sort of struck me when I was going through the EEG area in particular was how people use quite different protocols to approach their data analysis. And I guess the main thing for me was, how replicable or how repeatable were these pipelines that they were using. So, and how your outcome measures can be quite strongly affected by which decision or which analysis you use at particular points. And I found it a bit hard to know exactly how people went along and sort of pre-processed and analyzed their data. So I guess the biggest thing for me was how comparable are all the different studies that people are generating, and if it's hard for us to know how comparable they are, then how meaningful are each individual study? So that's kind of, so I wouldn't say disillusioned exactly, but I felt a little bit, downtrodden that things weren't as transparent as I would like to see. So there was a little bit of coaxing and persuasion from Matthew. And after some conversation, I was like, yeah, I think it's really important that we do make everything that we do transparent, but also accessible. Any data that we collect or any analyses that we do, it is really for the benefit of, society and the community. And a lot of us are funded by, the government, and there is an expectation from stakeholders that this information will become available, and I kind of don't see why the public can't have access to the data. So, and I think there was one really recent high-profile example, the Lancet, how it retracted articles, and the individuals who had access to the data were putting it behind a wall of this confidentiality, we can't provide it to you, etc. And I was like, well, how are we going to verify and trust research findings? And we can't trust that, then what can we trust? So I think those are some of the things that have motivated me to be much more interested in open science practices, and trying to work towards incorporating those principles into what I do into the future. But I have to admit, I am a teaching academic, so the amount of research I could actually do is just proportionally related to how much teaching I have to do. So I'll see what I can do for what I'm hoping to do within my group at the CNU at Deakin is to try to be a prototype to basically show the other researchers in the group that it can be done. And it doesn't, I think there's a bit of hesitation because, we're also busy already, that people might find that incorporating these new principles might be so much more work. But in actual fact, it doesn't have to be that much more work on top of what we already do. And I think ultimately, these small things that we contribute now will lead to better outcomes in the future. So I'm hoping to be sort of a beacon and a prototype for my group, so that hopefully some of these practices can start to be incorporated at a more baseline level for the whole of the group. So.
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the key ambitions for what Anzorn does is try to make it easier for people to be that prototype within their own departments, because it's definitely the case that once there is a little bit of movement within a small institution, it's much easier to get subsequent people joining on. It's hard to go it alone, particularly as we're saying, like when all you're doing is finding this information in online dialogues, and I don't know the degree to which viewers and participants are part of the online Twitter academic community and participate in these online discussions. They can become quite heated and hostile. Having the ability to have a network to kind of support you navigating those early steps without feeling bad about yourself is really important. And then you can be that support for subsequent people around you, which I think is really critical to making these practices more normative.
Definitely handy to have a go-to person.
Yeah. So, and it's, yes, I do have a Twitter handle. So I'm one of the...
Yep. Pam, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hello, everyone. So I am a PhD student, candidate, I should probably use that word. Nearing the end, was meant to finish in October, but alas, COVID. So now that will be happening next year. So I'm stuck for another year. But as Michael said, I do transcranial magnetic stimulation, a type of brain stimulation as well. But my particular focus, Michael's more focused, I guess, on the methods and the technicalities of using TMS. I'm more an application-based of how to using TMS to answer certain questions. I'm particularly focused on motor imagery, people's ability to imagine movement and motor development. And I particularly focus in a clinical group called developmental coordination disorder, which is not a very commonly known disorder, although it affects at least 300,000 children in Australia. So trying to bring awareness to that and trying to understand how those motor impairments develop and trying to understand the underlying neural basis of those impairments, and if we can hopefully create interventions in the future to treat those motor impairments. So that's my main focus of my PhD. I guess in terms of all this that's happening today and how I got involved, I met the wonderful Matthew, who brought me to the good side. About it. It was very conflicting, I think, coming on as a student in neuroscience, because obviously being a lot younger and newer, I'm hearing from one side all the new things that are emerging about open science and our need to be doing open science. Then you've got a lot of the older academics who are probably more set in their ways or not as informed about it. And so I was in this limbo trying to work out how to best navigate it. So I think that's how I got involved and started to talk to Matthew a bit more about understanding what does open science mean. I think I had a very different misconception of what it was. And trying to implement it as much as I can as a PhD student into my team and into my work. But also I noticed a lot of the things that Matthew noticed as well in neuroscience. There's not as much transparency about the steps and procedures involved in the research. So it's difficult to navigate and understand how people did those things or how they came to those conclusions, but particularly in the analysis side of things. I think like my particular area, the tasks, a lot of people seem to be analyzing their tasks a little bit differently or analyzing the technique a bit differently, but there's no real clear understanding of how they got to that or why they made the decisions they made. And perhaps maybe because there's a bit of argument about the ways to do it and people are a bit hesitant about, maybe putting on paper those kind of things. But I think it's really important, and I've noticed that I want to do that hopefully in the future, so that it's good to get that critical feedback from people being like, actually, that's not the best way to do things. Maybe you should try this. And I think if we do that, then we're going to make our research better. But until now, it's great that we have discussions, but there's no real clear explanation of how people do certain things in their research. So it makes particularly new people like me starting off going, I have no idea how people came to this conclusion and why they're doing this. So yeah, that's how I got involved.
Yeah, that was definitely something that struck me during my PhD. Is that like it feels like we're all starting afresh every time we do a PhD. You've got these papers and they tell you that they did some things, and then you go and figure out how to do your own thing. Like you write your own code, you figure out your own like pipeline. You have to choose from the thing that really got me into it. So I should introduce myself to you guys as well. So I am very recently graduated. So I did my PhD in cognitive neuroscience. Dr. Coops. And so my PhD was in the neural mechanisms of attention and prediction, because I was interested in consciousness, and there was this theory about how attention and prediction produce consciousness, basically. And so I did that using EEG and MEG, and used like a decoding technique called forward encoding to try and interrogate the sort of information processing in the brain. And through that process, that very long process, I discovered that, like, we've got this, what's it called, the garden of forking paths problem. And I think of all of the fields, I really think that neuroscience, or cognitive neuroscience in my case, is the worst example of this, because you've got, like, even just in a pre-processing pipeline, before you even do the analysis, you've got like something like 8 to 10 steps that you go through, each of which can have a different set of parameters. And you do the numbers, and suddenly you've got like a near infinite number of possibilities of how you can analyze a data set. And to me, it just kind of seemed crazy that like this stuff wasn't pre-registered and you didn't have to say up front what you're doing, but that you would get this like gamut of like possible outcomes that you can select from, and then potentially just publish the one that produces the most benefit to you, which under the current paradigm, unfortunately, is kind of impact. So that's based on significance and novelty. So I kind of saw that and was like, that doesn't seem right. Like, even in that example, I'd much rather that we published, what's it called when you publish like the multiverse of analyses, and then just go, here are like 100 analyses you could do, 60% of them show this result, 40% of them are nulls or whatever. Like, at least then you have the information on the table. And we as new PhD students can have a better grasp of what's going to be like a tractable line of research. And then also, as you said, and like how to actually do the stuff. That would be nice.
Yeah. It's definitely something that happens a lot in EEG, I feel. It's just, when I was starting to learn it, I was kind of, asking questions about, well, at this step, what do we do? And at this step, what do we do? And there is a lot of subjective decision making in that process. And again, it's kind of what Pam mentioned. There seems to be almost like two sort of schools about how you're meant to do it. It's just, one's like, no, it's all subjective. You got to go in there and like really, go through by yourself and check and observe and screen. And there's another school which is like, well, no, you should do it all algorithmically, because it takes out the decision making of the subjective person, which might miss certain things, but at least it's something that can be replicated. And so it's sort of this, and then there's a argument for combining the two. So I was just kind of like, well, how how reliable are these decisions, and then what kind of impact are they having on the final product? And we're actually trying to draw conclusions based on this. And I'm like, I don't know how robust these conclusions are based on all these decisions that I've made previously. So,
but yeah, so Tom was just saying that he found an example of like a really simple analysis, which is like using spin conductance, but with the Gardner forking paths can have a massive impact on the results. And there's a link there. And yeah, it really is, I think, pervasive through our field in particular, and it's something that open research practices can really help with.
I want to jump in and say that, like, it's important to note that, like, it's definitely the case that neuroscience is a rich environment for these types of. There is a lot of degrees of researcher degrees of freedom available in analysis of a neuroscience pipeline, but it's not idiosyncratically a neuroscience problem, and this is why I think having a community of people that can share traumatic experiences of finding similar types of gardens of forking paths in things like psychometrics, where my background's in, and saying fundamentally this is whether you're doing a factor analysis or a development of a scale, right? And you've got these same types of issues where so much of what we talk about so there are so many results dependent steps in the way that we progress through our research pipeline, irrespective of what we're studying. And I'm sure that applies not only to disciplines within psychology and neuroscience and brain sciences, but in other fields as well. There's this strong tendency for us to find ourselves in this situation where we are trapped into this results dependency in our decision-making process. And it's difficult to know exactly how to navigate that. And so having other people that can commiserate, among other things, and make you feel like you're not alone and you're not crazy, and starting to get that uncomfortable feeling, and potentially can point you in the direction of other resources that can help you navigate that path in a way that might be more principled, or at least provide you the scaffold to understand how you might deal with this more effectively, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's a great point, and I guess that's the benefit and point in hands-on being a domain general thing. Like, we can create clusters within, and I hope that we will, and I hope we'll build that cluster bigger than it already is. But as you say, like, so many of the processes transfer, and even the tools and other aspects, like just sort of projects and community groups and anything else that you might post. Like, actually, I was trying to remember how I found out about hands-on, and I remembered finally it was actually Ginny Barber, who is just an amazing advocate for open access, and particularly focused on open access. And because my pet project initially was based around open access, I got in touch with her, and then she was like, "Oh, there's this great network you really should find out about." And at that point, I didn't know any neuroscientists on there. But since then, I've connected with Tom Johnstone, who's like an amazing, in the crowd, and an amazing advocate for open research practices. And so it really is just like creating that network that we can support each other and tap into all of the tools and resources that we need. So then I guess that what I'd like to talk about is what we can do to sort of increase that community within the neuroimaging community. If there are strategies that we could adopt, or I don't know. I mean, we've sort of talked about this a bit before, Matt, like about how to build communities. And I don't know, maybe you've got some thoughts that you can share on how it's been with hands-on to get to this point.
I mean, it's really. I mean, I'm sure you'll have shared experiences with your experiences through our knowledge. It's easy to kind of have some success, but it's difficult to have broader success. I think what the original idea that we had is that it would be great if we could have more in-person connections. Now, obviously, that kind of, under the present circumstances, is not ideally suited to what we're experiencing. But definitely it's been, prior to pandemics messing with it, it has been the mechanism by which we've reached most people by having things like what we originally labelled as hacky hours, but we've now tried to broaden to be open research drop-ins. because we're trying to make sure that we're capturing people who are not necessarily interested in adopting like code for their digital humanities projects right now, but like are willing to talk about open access, and then we can get them on side pathways. And that process, we've effectively instituted a bunch of these, or connected to a bunch of these throughout institutes all over the place, and those provide good opportunities for people to find somewhere to come and just connect. Because I think, again, feeling like you're not the only person is really important to kind of growing that sense of community and making people feel more comfortable advocating, because they're not feeling like they're the only one person who believes that maybe we should make our papers open access, or these types of things. Again, I think the other component is effectively just, sorry, the cat has just come out of the study and is playing on the floor.
I can hear a bell.
Again, the joys of a pandemic. Part of it is effectively just a branding exercise, and a lot of it is just being visible. And where we've succeeded very effectively in growing as a community, it's been by making ourselves visible, by putting ourselves out there, by finding new ways to connect to new audiences, again, through things like this, but also through things like participating in things run by what was ResPlat and is now rebranded at University of Melbourne, going to conferences, these types of things, or even, to be perfectly honest, sometimes getting in spats on Twitter. But yeah, like these types of things is a really good way to kind of reach new audiences who are otherwise uncontacted, and finding ways to make them realize that there are other people that they can talk to and feel connected to.
Yep. Yeah, you raised a really good point before about rebranding the Melbourne Hacky Hour, because we recently issued a little update. The Brisbane Open Research Network, I should probably say as well that ANZON has little kind of clusters. So each city has a little open research network, and usually the acronym is like Brisbane will be BORN, which raises the question of what you do with Perth. But and so Brisbane, I should say, has we've made contact with, well, not made contact with, the University of Southern Queensland, who host a hacky hour, and I think there's another hacky hour that was in the chat. I don't have it to hand, but they've invited a couple of us to join, and so I think we'll probably go with that same strategy, like rebrand it open science hour, so that we can branch off and talk about whatever we're interested in. But I think that's a really good idea. We'll try and do.
Yeah, because again, it's that difficulty of finding things that are approachable for people, because I think people will select themselves out if they don't feel like it's open to them. I think when a lot of what we were trying to advocate in the early stages within our own department was adoption of R as an analytic platform. I think a lot of people opted out because it just seemed more intimidating. It just seemed hostile to them. And so by changing our approach a little bit and changing how we were emphasizing what was useful to people, I think we've managed to recruit new audiences.
So I have a question for all of you. We have these sort of hacky hours that were normally, pre-pandemic world based on trying to get locally and hacking away at a problem. And so then that's why we've got Brisbane Hacky Hour and the Melbourne Hacky Hour. But obviously that's changed, and we've been struggling a bit with the Brisbane network as a sort of local hub, and how do you move that forward in these times? But I'm only just thinking this now, but like, what if we were to have happy hours that were kind of discipline specific, so that we could kind of get into like really specific neuro problems? That obviously we're generalising to some extent, but that could then be Australia-wide, because obviously we've got the interwebs.
And I think that there's definitely a space for that, because again, people aren't necessarily seeing that this is a thing that's useful to them. I think we did have some early success with our Deakin open research drop-in, because we have a group of people, we have a small community of people within our own department that can form critical mass, and then we've got a few people that we've been connected to through things like our OpenSci and that. But I think there's definitely a space for capitalizing on connections that are more direct, because I know people, I have a colleague that used to be in our department, used to opt out of training exercises and these types of upskilling opportunities because they felt it just wasn't relevant to their work. And so only after the fact, many years down the pipeline, now they're engaging with all these training exercises like later in the process, because they didn't feel, because now they've realized that these things are critical to their ability to succeed. I think if we could try and make these things more directly appealing, then I think you would get more people. And so those opportunities do make sense. And for examples of that include things like open plant pathology, which is a collaboration of plant pathologists, so people that work in basically identifying crop diseases and treating crop diseases and that sort of thing. This is a international sort of organization of people that just all care about making plant pathology more transparent and open. And they've now got this very successful online distributed seminar series that helps them connect with each other and share ideas and that sort of thing. So there's prototypes for that type of model, and I'm sure they would be happy to share.
I know a couple of those. They're in Adam Sparks.
Yep.
And Paul Malloy. Is that his surname?
Yeah. And they're both at USQ, and then Emerson Del Ponte and other people elsewhere in the world.
I think as well, particularly for students, I can only speak from a student perspective, but I think, and it's a lot more difficult to navigate because it involves the university, but just having workshops early on in the year that's available starting off to get a better understanding of what open science is and what it involves and the pros and cons of everything is really important, because I think, well, from my experience with students, we learn about it kind of once we've started through our PhDs and we've set everything up. And if you've got 10 supervisors who are a little bit, they don't use coding, or for example, they're not aware of the open science platforms and all those kind of things, it makes it very difficult for students to then navigate them themselves, because you're going to more likely be not adopting those things because you're like, well, my team can't help me, so I'm going to be by myself. I'm just going to carry on and keep doing what they're doing. So I think having those things set up early on so that students can have an understanding and be like, okay, these are the things that I can do, and then present them to their team and hopefully try and set up their projects from the beginning with those things will help it. I think it will help it a lot better. Luckily for me, I was involved in the department with Matthew and stuff, where although our neuroscience department doesn't do a lot of coding necessarily, although a lot of things have changed, and open science wasn't a very commonly agreed upon idea or understood, I was able to connect to other people outside my department and somehow bring it in a little bit. But I know a lot of students don't have that. And I've met a lot of students along the way where they're already a year or 2 years in and they're like, oh, well, I can't really change things now. And it's like, yeah, so I think having those maybe workshops early on in the year that new students can attend, I think is pretty important as well.
I think it might be a good idea to actually, Tom's having a field day in the chat. It'd be good to have Tom join us. And
I can only have 4 people on screen though with this platform, so someone would have to.
You can, yeah. You can take me off.
Are you sure?
Yeah, that's all right. I'll make myself known in the comment section.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. We can switch it around again.
So I'll vamp for the meantime. I think it's really good to emphasize, like Tom's point that he's raising, one of the best ways to spread the word is to have people be in a better position to have broader audiences. I think this is obviously a big thing in the current conversation, that you can give a person a platform for anything, for one thing, but they'll use it for anything else. So if you're in a position to have more access to more audiences to advocate for these types of things, then that's going to be a bigger influence in your ability to advocate for these things and have the changes that you want to see in your research environment.
So Tom,
Hey everyone.
Hi Tom, good morning again.
Hey, Tom.
I feel a bit guilty about kicking Michael off
I'm sure he'll
the
survive.
screen. Yeah, I just wanted to plug that because it's a case that apparently were thanks, Mike. There were things there were applications that went in for these executive positions in the OHBM Australian chapter, but I think they all tended to be sort of the typical sort of male-dominated, and it would be great to have a bit more diversity. And I think for many reasons, cultural and otherwise, some people are less likely to nominate themselves because they feel perhaps they're not at the level or for whatever other reason. And so I would just say encourage people to get in there and nominate yourself. It's a wonderful experience, and it develops your own science and your own knowledge of what's going on, as well as it really benefits the sector. So anyway, that's my plug for the OHBM. So anybody out there that you know as well, suggest it to them to put in a nomination. I've loved the talk, and that you've been having. I totally agree. It would be nice to have some sort of hack hours or whatever on certain topics. For example, cognitive neuroscience or neuroimaging, and perhaps we can think about a platform or platforms that would help support that, so that not only do we get together and talk, but perhaps we have a space where we can actually work collaboratively. I mean, things like Jupyter Notebooks are perhaps a good example of how you can do that sort of thing, but there might be other platforms, even something like a virtual machine set up in the cloud with a shared desktop might facilitate that.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I'm just saying there's a question actually, I missed it. We've got 2 upvotes, so it's highly sought after. So the question is, what type of pushback do you get when pitching OS practices in recordings? Any solid arguments other than great question. Would anyone like to answer that?
Like, I've already chipped in the comments, but I'll reiterate. I think a lot of these, this is not a new position, that a lot of the pushback against the adoption of open practices aren't necessarily strong or particularly solid, because they're predicated on things like fear of scooping, which there's very, very low evidence of scooping. There's if there's a fear of being exposed to more criticism. So if I share my code, then I'm more likely to have my paper criticized, where fundamentally it seems like contrary to the norms and values that we're ascribing to, that if we don't want to make our paper open to criticism. But I think with a lot of these things, the criticisms to the adoption of these practices don't have to be strong, because the practices are novel, right? And as we know, structures support the status quo. So I think you kind of need to find other ways, rather than necessarily trying to respond to those criticisms directly, from my experience, in order to navigate these things. And so for me, my experience, the best way to advocate for a PI to adopt more open practices is to convince them that it's in their cynical best interest to do it. So like, if they stand to gain, then they're more likely to adopt these practices. And the only other thing is normative pressure, kind of pushing people to see that everyone else is doing it and they'll be left behind. Or in, say, for example, in Pam's case, that processes that she's adopted make her workflow substantially faster and more reliable than the historical workflows. And so fundamentally, you're just cynical advantage in doing so.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. First of all, that like lots of these things they're more a belief than an actual assessment of the evidence. But Phil has raised a really good point about what about POPs and open access data in your image currently. I think it's 3,000 because I just published with them, or that maybe you're right. But I know Nature Communications is 5,000. Oh, it's 3,000. Yes. Yeah.
It's always in that.
But that is the point, isn't it? So, like one of the blowback that you get. I mean, forget neuroimage. Like, there's an amazing journal that I'd like to talk about tomorrow at the Grand Knowledge session called Neurons, Behavior, Data, and Theory. It's called name. But it's free to publish. It's got a great editorial board. It's free to read. It's just everything, you know, open data, open access. And the problem, I think, the pushback is the impact in the publishing field. It's the impact factor or prestige or reputation, whatever you want to call it. So on that side of things, I think that is probably a legitimate concern that people have, and definitely research has shown that these CRs are very worried about impact factor. That's what we have the impression is that makes or breaks our career. And so I think a lot of the but then ironically, like if you do publish just a preprint, the data shows that you get more citations. So even just free and open access is a boon for your career, and that's like a really good response that you can make to someone that says that. You can say actually the evidence shows that you just have to take the preprint and you can increase your citation rate, and then therefore you get that personal benefit as well as the public benefit. So yeah, and that's actually a great thing that hands-on is great for, because I've seen questions on there from I presume psychology that have said, hey, what do I do when my supervisor doesn't want to publish a preprint? And then someone will be like, boom, show them this paper, right? And then they'll see the personal benefit and realize that it's actually not a negative at all.
I think what Matthew said is definitely my experience too. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, particularly like a neuroscience perspective about what science is. And I think people as the well, which I found quite odd at the beginning. For example, with pre-registration, I've heard this from multiple people that there's this fear because with neuroscience, as Matthew said before, where it's not quite linear in our methods that we take, you know, from piloting alone, we end up changing so much and all this stuff. And I think there's a fear that, you know, doing those sort of things like pre-registering means that we have to stick to this way and we can't be transparent about what we're doing, even though that's not the point. We can say that no, things had to change because of this, and like be really open. And that's the whole point of open science, is about being transparent about those methods and steps that we do. But I think it's like the opposite. There's this fear that we're not allowed to be, and that it will expose us in some ways and show us as bad researchers, when that's not the case at all. That's certainly something I've heard multiple times from people.
One thing I'd say about the feedback aspect is that you know, I still get feedback from my colleagues. You know, so it's so embedded. I still get feedback, I should say, from my colleagues. It's so embedded that as bad as it is, I mean, it's so bad that it not only affects CCRs, it also affects, you know, senior researchers, which is just unbelievable to me. But there you go. It's so embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
And so, you know, people such as myself have an obligation, I think, to do what we can at the higher levels and committees at universities. We're trying to do that at Swinburne. I'm trying to do it through some other committees I'm involved in at the moment. Oddly enough, often the biggest pushback I get from my colleagues, from my senior colleagues, about adoption of more open science practices and so forth is, oh, well, it's not good for the early career researchers. It's going to hurt their careers. We're only doing this to protect the careers of our trainees. So that just sort of shows you how sort of convoluted these things can become, I think. Yeah, it is a slow process, and I don't think there's any particular magic bullet. I still live in the hope that there's going to be a bit of a snowball effect, and all it's going to take is a few really good, strong platforms that are going to change things around. But that's more of a hope than a prediction at the moment.
I have some thoughts on that, but I'll leave that for tomorrow's session.
I don't want to, like, this is going to be a little bit cynical, probably not sit well with Cooper's natural inclination on this, but I feel like that for those reasons, I think individual actions are not necessarily the actions that are going to really fundamentally change this problem. It really, I mean, obviously there is some potential for collective action responses to try and motivate the kind of changes that we want to see in the structure of the academy that would resolve some of these issues, and that would be things like instead of there being, you know, for-profit publication government mandates that all funded projects get published in repositories owned by like national government or whatever, which eliminates some of the impact pressure and these types of things and changes the way that these are prioritized. But that's a big structural solution that needs to have a structural problem that needs a structural solution. That I think there needs to be a combination of these type of bottom-up individuals adopting good practices and supporting other people adopting these good practices, but fundamentally that those sort of things, these symptoms, these pushbacks that we get are a function of the structure and the system that is broken in favor of it, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that top-down and bottom-up can work together, and I think the ideal solution is both at the same time. The grassroots movement is supported by the structures that they. But I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up this session, and this has been so amazing. I think it's so good to connect with all of you and chat about how we can move forward with hands-on and specifically within the neuroimaging community. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of the people in the room asking questions. I saw that you asked Tom a question. I'm sorry we didn't get to that, but perhaps Tom can type in that, or he'll be able to because the question was put up. So
I commented in the question box, so hopefully that, and Ian can contact me, like, so
I have
I'd
not
be happy to discuss it more.
F1000, but if anyone would like to comment on my own question there, then please do in the box.